Okay guys, chapter 7 and chapter 8. So we left off with Richard picked up the skink by the tail, and the tail was still in Beast's hands. And he's feeling very upset about this. He thinks he killed the skink. Chapter 7. Head down, Richard took the steps 2 at a time. He ran right into Mrs. Miller. Oof! He tried to catch his breath. "What's your name, young man?" Mrs. Miller asked. "Sorry," Richard said. "No, don't tell me." Mrs. Miller raised her hand in the air. "I know. You're the one with that awful nickname, Beast." Richard nodded. "You're the one from that class, that climbing class. The children who want to kill themselves, right? Such silliness, climbing up to the gym ceiling." "Not me," said Richard. "Yes, you." Richard shook his head. Mrs. Miller stopped talking for a moment. She rubbed her stomach. "You ran right into me. Can't believe it." "I'm sorry," Richard said again. "You're just the one who's going to fall off that gym ceiling." Richard didn't answer. "Break your neck." "That's what I'm afraid of," said Richard. "Afraid?" Mrs. Miller asked. "Afraid?" So there he is, bumping into Mrs. Miller, not watching where he's going. Miller the killer. "Afraid," Richard said. It felt good to finally say it out loud. Mrs. Miller took off her eyeglasses. She rubbed them against her blue sweatshirt. Clean them off. "Let's get off the stairs," she said. "Next thing you know, someone else is going to try to bump into me." She clunked down the stairs. Richard thought about the skink without his tail, the skink with a little dot of blood. He followed Mrs. Miller down the stairs. "I think I killed the class skink," he said. "Killed a skink?" Mrs. Miller said. "What next?" "Well, I didn't do it on purpose. It was an accident." Then he shook his head. "I shouldn't have done it." "Tail fell off?" Mrs. Miller asked. Richard nodded. "Were you holding up in the air by his tail?" "Yes." "Not a very nice thing to do to a skink." "I know," said Richard. "Don't worry, though," said Mrs. Miller. "It'll grow a new one." Richard blinked. "You think so?" "I know so. Skinks drop their tails off to get away from something." She frowned. "Or someone. That's how they defend themselves from their enemies." "Oh," said Richard. "It was afraid, you know," said Mrs. Miller. "He isn't a coward," Richard said. Mrs. Miller frowned again. "Being afraid doesn't make you a coward. Everyone's afraid sometimes." Richard looked at her. He wondered if it were true. Then he heard the bell ring. "Time to go back to your room," Mrs. Miller said. Richard started up the stairs. "It'll grow a new one," Mrs. Miller called, "in a little while." "That's great. Young man," Mrs. Miller called again. "Animal!" This should be Beast. Richard turned around. "Beast," he said. "You're afraid?" "Of the gym rope." Mrs. Miller frowned for the 3rd time. "See me after school," she said. "In the gym." Richard hurried toward the classroom. He couldn't wait to tell everyone. He couldn't wait to say the skink would grow another tail. He stopped at the classroom door. "Miller the killer," he said. He wondered what she'd do to him after school. Then he started to think. Mrs. Miller said everyone was afraid sometimes. Everyone? He couldn't believe it. Then he thought of Jason and Timothy. They didn't touch the skink. Why not? Maybe they were afraid. He bet they were. He opened the door. Just then Jill came dashing out. "Save me," she yelled. "There's a cricket in my desk." "Oh, don't worry," he said. Inside he could hear Jason laughing. He could hear Timothy making little chirpy noises. "Skink's gonna get you," he yelled at them. He opened the door. "Rope's gonna get you," Jason yelled back. Richard swallowed. They were probably right. So you have Jason still teasing Richard, but yet Mrs. Miller, well, she might be the solution. She actually told Richard about the skink's tail. That made him feel much better. He was feeling awful guilty about that. And then she said, "See me after school." Well, make a prediction. What could she want to do with Richard after school and in the gym? So, chapter 8. Let's find out. Richard poked his head out the school door. "Go home without me," he told his sister Holly. "Are you in trouble again?" Holly asked. Richard didn't answer. Holly shook her frizzy head. "Mommy's going to be mad." "Oh, just get out of here," Richard said. He banged the door shut. He walked down the hall to the gym. Mrs. Miller was standing inside. "There you are," she said. "Yes," said Richard. For a moment, Mrs. Miller didn't say anything. Sorry I ran into you, he said. Mrs. Miller nodded. My sister Holly is waiting, Richard said. I better go home now. I think he's trying to avoid something. Mrs. Miller shook her head. Don't be silly. We have some business to take care of. Oh, said Richard. Do you know what everyone calls me, Mrs. Miller said. Richard pretended to be thinking. He looked up at the ceiling. He made believe he was thinking of something. Miller the killer, said Mrs. Miller. Oh, said Richard again. Didn't you ever hear that? Richard didn't know what to say. I guess, maybe, because you know he knows it. Mrs. Miller leaned forward. Richard could see the frown lines on her face. I'll tell you something, she said. There's one way to stop being afraid. Really? Richard asked. Climb the rope, said Mrs. Miller. Richard backed away. I don't think I can. That's how you stop being afraid. That's what we're going to do right now. Mrs. Miller took a step forward. Guess what? What? I'm afraid of the rope too. Really? Richard asked. Mrs. Miller grinned. If I had a tail, it would drop off as soon as I climbed the rope. Richard started to laugh. He kept thinking of Mrs. Miller with a tail. He thought of himself with a tail. Just then, Holly poked her head in the gym. Yes, said Mrs. Miller. I'm waiting for my brother. Mrs. Miller waved her hand. Tell your mother the animal will be home late today. Holly started to giggle a little bit. Animal. Go ahead, said Mrs. Miller. Well, Richard's not supposed to cross Linden Avenue, Holly said. Mrs. Miller put her hands on her hips. Don't be silly. He doesn't look both ways, Holly said. My mom's afraid he'll get hurt. I do so, said Richard. He certainly will look both ways today, said Mrs. Miller. He's almost out of Miss Rooney's class. Tell your mother I said so. Holly closed the gym door. Inside it was very quiet. Now, said Mrs. Miller, we're going to climb that rope. Richard rubbed his hands on his jeans. I tried to think. I tried that. It doesn't work. That's because Miller the killer wasn't around, she said. I'll catch you if you fall. So it's good that she's got a sense of humor about her nickname and very thoughtful to try to help Richard, don't you think? Richard ducked his head. He tried to swallow. His mouth was dry. Grab that rope, said Mrs. Miller. Richard reached out for the rope. Started to move a little. He closed his eyes. Open your eyes, said Mrs. Miller. Look where you're going. Richard jumped up a little. He grabbed the first knot. Don't let your feet drag down like that, Mrs. Miller said. Get him off the floor. Richard pulled his feet up under him. He looked at Mrs. Miller. I'm right here, she said. If you fall on me. I'm a great pillow. Richard reached the next knot. Oh, for the next knot. So here he is. And this is Mrs. Miller, which I think is pretty darn nice of her to stay after school to help Richard. You know, I mean, maybe they should change her nickname from Miller the Killer to something a little more nicer. He pulled himself up. He looked down. His feet were even with Mrs. Miller's head. Now look where you're going, animal, said Mrs. Miller. Now, where have you been? Just don't kick me in the head. Richard reached for the fourth knot, then the fifth. He looked up at the ceiling. There was still a long way to go. Don't look down, said Mrs. Miller. Richard took a quick peek. He was pretty high up, very high. His hands were wet, so you can tell he's sweaty, he's nervous. You're doing great, said Mrs. Miller. You're almost halfway up. Richard stopped to catch his breath. His hands hurt from holding on. Far enough, he said. Oh, one more knot, said Mrs. Miller. Richard reached up. He pulled himself to the next knot. I don't think I can get down, he said. Of course you can. He lowered himself down a little. After a minute, it seemed easier than going up. He jumped down the last foot. Not bad, said Mrs. Miller. Hey, said Richard, pretty good. He smiled at Mrs. Miller. Tomorrow morning, we'll do it again, said Mrs. Miller. When Mr. Bell comes back, you'll have to do it alone, but you'll be ready. Richard stopped smiling. He'd never be able to do it alone, never. Time to go, said Mrs. Miller. Right, said Richard. Thanks. He went down the hall. He couldn't believe he had gone halfway. Then he sighed. He'd never be able to get up the rest of the way. He shouldn't have that negative self-talk. That's what Miss Bannock would say. She'd say, have that positive self-talk. I can do it. I can do it. So, you know, it's really nice of Mrs. Miller to help Richard. She did not have to do that. So we can say she's very thoughtful. And Richard better appreciate this. And tomorrow when we read chapter 9, we're going to see Will he be able to do it again? Will he be able to do it by himself? Or will he chicken out? And by the way, I'm curious myself. Can Jason climb up to the top? Can Timothy do that? After all, they were making fun of Richard. Maybe they can't. And let's check on the skink. Will the tail grow back? Will Richard feel better about what happened? And will he learn to speak up for himself and not let people bully him into doing things he knows is wrong? So that's it, my friends. Until chapter 9, Shermanators out.